All right, everyone. Hello. My name is Thomas, and welcome to my channel. I do educational videos on many different subjects. Today, we're going further into the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. This is a theory of everything that Larson derived all the way from his first intuitions about this in 1930 or so, all the way up until his death in 1990. And we are actually looking at his final book, Beyond Space and Time, which came out in after he died in 1995. And this book is his efforts into metaphysics, philosophy, religion, psychology, and the like, the occult even a little bit. And we're looking at this, it gives us an idea of his kind of fully realized theory, where, it took him very many years to kind of work out the kinks. And so we want to look at this, and eventually we're going to go back and look at his earlier books that are mostly on the hard sciences, astronomy, physics, and chemistry, especially. Now, the gist of Larson's theory is that the universe is not made out of matter. The universe is not made out of energy. The universe is made out of motion. And motion is the relationship between space and time. Space and time are in a fraction together. They are reciprocals of each other. And they both have the same type of qualities. Space being three-dimensional. Therefore, by the reciprocal idea, time is also three-dimensional. And time being progressing or flowing, it's always getting later and later. And thereby, space is also flowing. Everything is always getting further and further apart. And that's called the recession of the distant galaxies. Now, space and time are both in discrete units, meaning that there is a minimum unit of space and a minimum unit of time. They are quantized. And so when they are both one unit of space in 1 unit of time, we have the speed of light. The speed of light is, unlike Einstein, who says that the speed of light is the maximum speed of the universe, Larson says that the speed of light is the midpoint of the universe. Half of the universe is moving actually faster than the speed of light. That half he calls the cosmic sector, or sector 2. The familiar sector, sector 1, or the material sector, is the sector we live in, where everything is moving slower than the speed of light. This is the world of atoms and molecules. And although over here we have the world of cosmic atoms and cosmic molecules, by the reciprocal system again, you have the speed of light, you have sector 1, sector 2. We know about sector 1. We know how things work there. We can extrapolate to over here to figure out how things are working over here. They're the same. Over here, we have space over time relationships. Over here, we have time over space relationships. All you have to do to cross the boundary is invert space and time. Switch the roles of space and time. Over here, we have 3D coordinate space, and we have progressing time. That's the scalar motion of time. It moves in with a magnitude, but it has no particular direction. And so over here, you would envision this with a balloon and a magic marker, put dots on the balloon, blow up the balloon. All of the dots are moving away from each other, but not in any particular direction. Over here, we have three-dimensional time, what he calls coordinate time, coordinate space and coordinate time. And we also have progressing space. So space is always getting further and further and further apart. Okay, so over here, we progress through aggregation, bonding similar molecules or valent molecules or atoms bonding to each other until it gets to its most complex level, which is called DNA. And at that point, DNA becomes eligible to be controlled, taken over by a sector 2 unit. Sector 2 comes over and mates with sector 1, and that is called the life unit, according to Larson. So life is a mixture of combination of a sector 1 unit entity and a sector 2 entity. Now, that sector 2, that life unit, then develops or evolves, and up until the point that it gets to its most complex level, which Larson says is the human being, the intelligent human being. And at that point, the intelligent human being becomes eligible to be taken over in a further control by a sector 3 unit. So now sector 3 is the region that is independent of space and time, or outside of space and time, or beyond space and time. Larson calls this the metaphysical sector, and he calls it sector 3. Other people would call that God, or gods, or the spirit world, or something to that nature. Now, the human is under the control of sector 3 and sector 2. Sector 2 is geared toward survival. This is the life. This is life, geared toward survival. But sector 3 is geared toward ethical behavior or good behavior. There are many times when those two things work in harmony and there's no conflict. But there are also many times when they work in conflict. And the human being must choose one or the other. That's really the concept of free will. And Larson gets into that in chapter 17. He also, in the earlier chapters, gets into many different kinds of communications from sector 3 to the life unit. And sector 3 is geared toward good behavior or ethical behavior, and it communicates with us through some kind of transmission mechanism, and it's always right. It's always giving us right information, but our ability to translate it properly is limited, and so sometimes we get our signals crossed. But those different forms of communication are variously known as ESP, intuition, religious revelation, scientific insight. Those are all forms of communication from sector 3. Okay, now we're in chapter 19, which is called Good and Evil. And we're taking over here toward the end of the chapter where he's talking about philosophers kind of being confused with the distinction between moral and non-moral values. The term values is how he's identifying like kind of plus and minus in terms of whether something is moral or whether it's immoral. But then there is the entire neutral category that is non-moral. And this is kind of where you think of as economic decisions. Am I going to have an apple or am I going to have an orange? That's a decision, but it's really a non-moral decision. Or I would say minimally moral decision. And There's no real sector 3 implications on the non-moral decisions. And then also with the non-moral decisions, they are multi-faceted. You can have an apple or an orange or a pear or a pineapple. You can choose, you have many, many, many options. But when you're making a moral decision, you have two options. You have good and you have evil. And so he's going to try to clear this up for us. The resulting atmosphere of confusion and contradiction is the factor that has opened the door to such ideas as ethical relativism. Neither the religious nor the philosophical value systems give adequate attention to the fact that the status of an action as right or wrong depends on the net balance of the positive and negative moral values of all of the various elements that enter into the act or its consequences. If positive moral values of some kind are involved in a dishonest act, or an act that causes injury to another individual, that act is not necessarily wrong in its totality, even though dishonesty and intentional injury are morally wrong in themselves. As brought out in the previous discussion, the balance of good and evil in any complex action can only be ascertained by considering the act in the setting in which it takes place and summing up all of the positive and negative moral values, thus arriving at a net result. Progress toward a higher ethical level depends not only on strengthening the determination to follow the moral code wherever there's a choice to be made, but also on developing a greater proficiency in evaluating the moral aspects of these complex situations and arriving at the correct balance of values. It will not be possible to give this subject any more comprehensive treatment here. One thing that stands out clearly is the need for a critical review of the prevailing attitudes towards some of the specific items that enter into moral judgments. Truth, for instance, occupies an important place in ethical considerations, so central in many respects that some moralists and many laymen insist that the obligation to tell the truth is absolute and that lying is morally wrong under any circumstances. Those who subscribe to the end theories of morality counter this by citing cases in which serious consequences will ensue if the truth is told. A favorite example being that of the individual who lies to conceal a death from a critically ill relative to whom the news might be a fatal shock. Both of these schools of thought are guilty of oversimplification, failing to give due consideration to the complexity of human actions. A proper evaluation of the morality of the action must take into account both the act and its direct and indirect consequences. In the case cited, the positive moral value of avoiding a serious injury to the sick relative far outweighs the negative moral value that could be assigned to the untruth, even if we were able to concede that lying is inherently immoral. But when we examine the situation more closely, we find that such a conclusion is unwarranted. Lying is not inherently or actually wrong per se. It is merely a type of action which may be used for unethical purposes. This becomes especially clear if we look at the general category of deliberate deception, of which lying is only one form. It is obvious that we cannot condemn deception as inherently wrong. In many cases, we want to be deceived. We are even willing to pay such persons as stage magicians and writers of mystery stories to deceive us. And most of us enjoy a well-executed April Fool's joke, even if the laugh is at our expense. Few games could be possible if deceiving the adversary was prohibited. Certainly, much deception is aimed at unethical ends, but in order to avoid serious errors in ethical judgments, it is essential to realize that it is the use to which the deception is put that determines the moral status of the act. The deception itself is neither moral nor immoral. It is not analogous to such things as deliberate infliction of an injury, where the act is wrong and accomplishment of some positive moral purpose is necessary in order to arrive at a net positive balance of moral value. The deception has no moral implications in itself, and the net moral balance is determined entirely by its consequences. Another example of misdirected criticism is furnished by the individual who is disinclined to work. The religious authorities commonly inveigh against the lazy man and brand his course of conduct as a breach of the moral code. But in fact, this is a judgment based on economic values, not on moral values. The lazy individual has made an economic decision, a decision as to the relative value of the products of effort as compared to that of the leisure that would be enjoyed if the work were not undertaken. This is a decision that is continually being made by others, even by the strongest critics of indolence. The general adoption of the 5-day week, for instance, is a recognition of the increased relative value placed on leisure by society as a whole. Laziness is no more immoral than asking for a reduction of the work week. The difference between the two is only a matter of degree. Quite commonly, the result of laziness is that the individual in question fails to do something that the moral code requires, supporting his family, which is a contractual obligation, let us say. But the morally reprehensible item is the non-support, not the laziness, and there is no necessary connection between the two. This and the discussion of deliberate deception may seem to involve a considerable amount of hair splitting, but the objective of the present discussion is to show that the new information developed in this work points the way to the specific and consistent ethical theory which has hitherto been lacking. For this purpose, careful and precise distinctions are indispensable. The essential requirement of morality cannot be equated with or related to anything but morality itself, since it is simply the requirement of compliance with the moral code. In this respect, it is identical with the requirements for legality, the criterion of which is compliance with the law. In either case, we cannot arrive at a judgment on the basis of the nature of the act, or even on the combined basis of the act and its immediate consequences. If A shoots B, the legal verdict may be first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, self-defense, or accident, and the moral judgment may vary within an equally wide range. The entire setting of the act and all of its legal and moral aspects must be taken into consideration in order to arrive at the proper moral judgment. Whether or not there is legal culpability is one of the moral aspects, even though the legal and moral judgments may differ substantially. Every person has a moral obligation to obey the law, even where no other moral consideration may be involved. Likewise, there is a moral obligation to honor any contractual requirements that may exist. If one accepts employment as a member of the police force, for instance, he has a moral obligation to do his best to apprehend a violator of the law, even though this may happen to involve risks that are far beyond anything that the ordinary citizen would be morally obligated to assume. This is a contractual obligation that the police officer accepts as a condition of employment. The moral code requires meeting these legal and contractual obligations. Any partial or total failure to do so is one of the debits that we enter, along with violations of specific provisions of the code in our balance account and weigh against whatever positive moral values may be involved in the particular act under consideration. The net resultant determines the morality of an act in its entirety. Inasmuch as the requirement for morality is conformity with the code of Sector 3, the fact that an individual believes that he has done the right thing does not make it right. It does not conform to the code if it is wrong, irrespective of any opinion. In extreme cases, this is so obvious that it's generally recognized. It is now conceded by everyone but the ethical relativists that burning heretics is morally wrong, even though those who participated in the burning were thoroughly convinced that they were carrying out God's will. But neither the moralists nor the general public have recognized that this is a general principle, that any violation of the code is morally wrong, even if the offender does not realize that he has transgressed. Intent to do wrong is a violation in itself, even if no actual harm results. But good intentions do not excuse morally wrong actions. A comprehensive knowledge of the provisions of the code and a careful examination of their application to all of the factors involved in any issue are just as important from the moral standpoint as the desire to do right. This view will no doubt meet with strong opposition. Not only from those who contend that morality should be judged on the basis of intent, but also from those who realize that few individuals have a complete understanding of the code and who feel that it is unjust to require individuals to live up to the rules that are beyond their comprehension. But neither intent nor justice enters into the determination of whether the moral code is being followed. This is purely a question of fact that is independent of the intentions and capabilities of the individual. Justice enters into the situation only in connection with the question as to whether a person should be held responsible for violations that he is not capable of recognizing as such. Okay, I think we're about out of time, but we will resume next time in Chapter 19 and move on to Chapter 20 here. So tune in, and we'll see you later. Thanks for tuning in.